Welcome. I'm truly glad you're here. Maybe you arrived by chance, or maybe you already knew that this space exists for those who are searching for something beyond noise, for those who choose to close their eyes and be gently wrapped in a story told slowly without rush. Before we begin this gentle journey, I invite you to stay with us. If you feel this quiet corner could be part of your nights, you can subscribe to the channel as if choosing to rest in a home where you are always welcome. You can also leave a like if the story begins to resonate with you, or share in the comments where in the world you are listening from and what time it is there. I love to imagine these words floating gently across distant rooms, drifting between cities, towns, soft beds, and tired minds, connecting us in the stillness of this shared moment. Think of every comment as a small lantern lit on the invisible map of those who are here now, sharing this moment with us. It doesn't matter if you're in a noisy city or a quiet countryside. If your night is cool or warm, if you're lying down with your eyes closed, or just letting the day slowly fade while you listen. This channel is a space created for that very purpose, to accompany you, to embrace with words, to help you loosen the day's rhythm and step gently into a story told with slowness, kindness, and quiet. So if you'd like to be part of this community of nighttime listeners, you are more than welcome. And now, with your body softening and your mind slowly quieting down, we can begin. In the depth of night, when the world's murmur begins to fade and the lights flicker in the distance like urban stars, a story awakens at the edge of sleep. It is a gentle story, an old one, woven from whispers and memories that don't quite belong to this time, but still float in the air like golden dust illuminated by the moon. I invite you to let your thoughts fall like leaves surrendering to the wind and to sink into a love story that knows no borders, no clocks, no permanent names, only promises made in hushed tones, sealed with the deepest silence of the soul. Imagine a place without age, where clocks don't tick, where the air is warm like an embrace, and the ground is covered in grass that never crunches beneath your feet. This is where it begins, or perhaps where it has always begun. This place doesn't appear on maps, and you don't stumble upon it by accident. You arrive only when the heart has traveled far enough to recognize something the body has no name for. In that secret corner of time, two souls found each other and made the decision to never part again. Perhaps they were strangers, or perhaps they had spent centuries recognizing each other in the eyes of the other. Memory is not always faithful, but the soul remembers without words. When they first crossed paths in that seasonless meadow, they said nothing. They didn't need to. The wind touched their faces as if celebrating the meeting, and the sun filtered through the leaves with a softness that seemed to bless the moment. In that suspended moment, without before or after, they looked at one another during a long silence, not awkward, but full, rich with presence. It was as if time had granted them permission to breathe together for the first time, to let their heartbeats fall into rhythm. Neither of them spoke, but both understood that something was unfolding, something beyond logic, something that could not be ignored. The pact was made without words, without signatures, without visible witnesses. It was a vow planted like a seed in the center of their beings, with the promise to bloom again and again, life after life, body after body. The place, the language, the history, it wouldn't matter. They would always find their way back to each other, always. Like the river returning to the sea, like sunlight slipping through the same window at dawn. From then on, the centuries began to turn like the pages of a book opened in the wind. Sometimes they were kings and beggars, artists and soldiers, hidden lovers, or elderly souls touching hands quietly in a park. In each life, their paths would intertwine in new ways, but the essence remained unchanged, that silent recognition, that feeling of coming home. This is the story of those lives. Not all of them, perhaps just a few. Soft fragments, like petals floating in a still fountain. There is no need to remember everything, only enough for the soul to smile and quietly say, "Yes, I was there, I saw you, I loved you, and in remembering, one rests. Because what has been lived is never lost. It simply becomes a slow melody that soothes you into sleep. Before we begin to travel through these memories, take a deep breath. Inhale gently, as if you're breathing in for the first time. Exhale slowly, as if letting go of a weight you no longer need. Let your eyelids soften. Let your body find the perfect shape to rest in. There's no hurry. The story won't run away. It's here for you to listen to at your own pace, to immerse yourself in like someone floating in a warm lake beneath the stars. All you need to do now is allow. Allow the images to arrive, the gentle emotions to drift like slow-moving clouds across your awareness. If your thoughts wander, don't chase them. Let them go, like paper boats on a calm river. Return to the sound of this voice, to this rhythm, to this moment. This is where the journey begins. In this first night of memories, we'll visit a life where everything appeared different, yet the essence remained. She was called Alina. He, at that time, was named Gale. But names don't matter as much as what connected them. His hands were strong, and his eyes carried the wisdom of ancient sunsets. She spoke little, but when she did, it was as if the wind changed direction just to listen to her. They lived in a stone village, where the houses smelled of firewood and the sky stretched vast above them. Days passed without urgency, moving with the quiet rhythm of the trees and the seasons. But beneath that calm, something pulsed softly, an unspoken connection, a promise that didn't need to be fulfilled quickly, because it already existed, because it always had. Alina often walked barefoot along the river's edge, gathering small wildflowers to press between the pages of her books. Cale worked with his hands, crafting wooden objects that seemed to have a spirit of their own. They each followed their own path, but in their dreams, they were already together. Sometimes they would wake with the quiet sensation of not having been alone. And though they didn't speak of it, they both knew something was waiting. The air in that village held a certain weight at sunset, as if time thickened, as if everything breathed more slowly. Shadows lengthened, and the river's murmur turned into a song. It was during one of those sunsets that they crossed paths for the first time. A simple passing, footsteps meeting on a dusty path. But in that passing, something lit up. Not firelight. In a time when the seasons still dictated the rhythm of life and clocks did not rush anyone, Cale lived in a wooden cabin near the forest, just a few steps from the river. His home smelled of pine, damp earth, and well-used tools. Days began with the gentle song of birds and the soft creaking of branches swaying in the breeze. He would wake with a body heavy from deep sleep, stretching slowly as if his soul was returning from afar. Each morning, his ritual remained unchanged. Opening the door, gazing at the sky, breathing in the fresh air, and listening to the constant flow of water. That constancy was his anchor, his calm, his certainty in a shifting world. His hands were large, strong, marked by years of repetition. Yet there was no clumsiness in them, only precision. Every object he carved bore the imprint of his patience, his love for simplicity and endurance. He worked in silence, accompanied only by the natural sounds weaving a soft symphony around him. The rustle of wind through pine needles, the distant echo of a bird call, the river's endless murmur. His thoughts moved slowly, drifting like leaves on the current. Sometimes memories would surface faces, fragmented images, dreams he couldn't tell if were his or borrowed from another time. But always, through those visions, she appeared. Alina lived on the other side of the river, in a small white house with a garden. Her mother tended herbs, and her father cared for boats. But Alina, since she was a child, preferred the water. She swam at dawn when steam hovered above the surface like a magical veil, and she would lie on the riverbank with her feet buried in the wet sand, letting the sun dry her slowly. She was quiet, observant, almost invisible to many, but the river knew her well. Every stone beneath the water seemed shaped by her steps, and fish approached fearlessly when she dipped her hands. Her presence was an extension of the landscape, as if nature had sculpted her in its own image. Kale needed only to watch her from afar. He did not spy or follow. He simply worked at his wooden bench, lifting his gaze occasionally to see her crossing the bridge, sitting with a book on her lap, or gathering flowers to press between pages. He had never greeted her. Sometimes he thought about it, but something stronger held him back. It wasn't shyness. It was an inner certainty, a feeling that the meeting would happen in its own time, like the ripening of fruit or the first snowflake of autumn. One morning, Kale dreamed he was walking along the river and found a blue flower that did not exist. Upon waking, he forgot the details but remembered the color, the soft feeling of being accompanied. Stepping outside, he went down to the water as usual. This time, the current carried something shining. He bent to pick it up, a blue ribbon, the exact shade from his dream. It was wet, light, scented with an unknown floral perfume that somehow felt familiar. He didn't know why, but he kept the ribbon as if it were a sacred talisman. That afternoon, the sky filled with slow-moving clouds that promised rain without hurry. The air felt heavy, as if the trees were breathing deeper. Kale did not work. He sat on his porch with a warm cup between his hands, staring at the horizon. The blue ribbon rested on the table. In that soft silence, he heard footsteps. Alina walked along the river path, stopping some distance from his house. Neither spoke. He simply lifted his head slightly, as if recognizing something ancient, and she nodded softly, answering a question never voiced aloud. From that day, their paths crossed more often. They didn't speak. It was unnecessary. They shared a floating presence, an unspoken understanding. Sometimes one sat on a rock while the other stayed on the opposite bank, watching the water together. It was a language made of pauses, gentle looks, and presences felt beyond the body. Kale dreamed again of the blue flower. Alina began wearing the same ribbon in her braid, as if she knew it no longer belonged only to her. One afternoon, with the breeze carrying the scent of damp earth and willow branches, bowing as if to touch the river, Alina crossed the bridge for the first time and sat beside him. No greeting was exchanged, nor did he ask questions. The silence between them was so comfortable, it seemed tangible. They shared a bowl of dried fruits and a warm drink. Each sip felt like a small ritual, an ancient gesture returning without words. When the sky turned orange and the first star appeared, she said softly, "I've been waiting for you." Kale felt something within him bloom like a night flower. It was not surprise, but remembrance. These words had been spoken before, in another place, in another voice. He replied simply, "So have I." That was all. Then silence wrapped around them again, but it was different. Now a silence full of promises invisible yet deeply felt, settling within them like a seed in fertile soil. In the days that followed, they walked the forest together. They asked no questions. They observed. They touched tree bark, listened to birdsong, paused to feel the wind on their skin. Sometimes they shared vague memories, fragments of childhood, dreams they couldn't tell if were their own or borrowed. But every word was a bridge, every silence a rest. They accompanied each other like two branches of the same tree, growing apart for years, but now reuniting. One night, beside the fire, Alina showed him something, an old notebook filled with drawings. Each page depicted a scene, a tower, a lake, a city of canals, a deserted beach. "I see them in my dreams," she said. Kale recognized some instantly. He, too, had been there. He knew without doubt, as one knows they have breathed before. "They are our other lives," she whispered. The fire seemed to dance brighter, as if celebrating the revelation. From that moment, they began remembering together, not as recalling a story, but as recovering a forgotten song. With soft laughter and long glances, they pieced together fragments. stitching time that did not belong to this life, but that they knew was theirs. Each memory brought certainty. They had always found their way back to one another. Always. On a particularly serene afternoon, as golden light caressed their faces, they made the pact. Not with solemn words or theatrical gestures, but by holding hands, looking deeply, and silently repeating the promise. I will find you, wherever you are, no matter our names, voices, or forms. That promise, sealed in silence, lingered in the air like a gentle breeze that never fades. After that, something changed, not in how they looked at each other or their walks together, but deep in the core of their days. Life continued its calm rhythm, but each moment was charged with something denser, deeper. A constant awareness of being part of an invisible thread, a web woven between worlds that held them no matter the time. Cale carved a small box adorned with ancient symbols. Inside, they placed the blue ribbon, a dried flower, and a piece of fabric embroidered with a bridge. Simple objects, yet heavy with meaning. They buried it beneath a tree growing by the riverbank. For when we return, Alina said, to remember that we have been here before. The tree watched silently, as if knowing they would return many times more. In another life, in another time, they were not surrounded by trees and rivers, but by stone and rain. The city stretched high and wide, built from pale marble that caught the light even on the gloomiest days. The streets wound through narrow alleys and opened suddenly into great plazas, where fountains danced and pigeons gathered like memories too heavy to fly. In this life, Alina was known as Mira, and Cale was Orion. They lived separate lives at first, she in a quiet studio filled with pressed flowers and antique ink, and he in a bookshop buried beneath the street, a hidden space where the world softened and slowed. Mira often wandered through the rain without an umbrella, letting the droplets trace lines down her cheeks like forgotten poems. She carried a notebook, always recording moments that others would have let pass, the way a curtain moved in a high window, the smell of bread at dusk, the voice of an old man singing to himself as he watered his balcony plants. She lived gently, almost invisibly, her presence brushing the edges of the world like silk against stone. Orion preferred the quiet of underground. His shop was small, but full of time. The air smelled of paper, dust, and something older perhaps, the residue of stories told too many times. He spent his days mending bindings, organizing shelves no one else touched, listening to the heavy silence between turning pages. His voice was soft, rarely used. He had forgotten the habit of being heard. Still, there was a calmness in his solitude, a sense that he was exactly where he was meant to be, waiting for something unnamed. Their meeting, when it came, was quiet. Mira entered the shop one afternoon as rain tapped softly against the stones outside. She wasn't searching for anything in particular, just shelter, perhaps, or the comfort of old pages. Orion looked up as the bell above the door chimed. Their eyes met across the narrow space, and time, for a long breath, held still. It wasn't shock. It wasn't even recognition in the usual sense. It was more like remembering a song you used to hum as a child, something buried in the bones. She browsed in silence, fingers grazing spines, eyes scanning titles without reading them. He pretended to return to his work, but his hands didn't move. When she reached the far shelf and turned, he was already looking. Neither smiled. There was no need. The air between them was full. Eventually, she walked to the counter and placed a small leather-bound book in front of him. "This one feels familiar," she said. He didn't reply. He simply wrapped it gently in brown paper and handed it to her as though passing her something sacred. After that, she came often. Sometimes she stayed only a few minutes, sometimes the whole afternoon. They rarely spoke. Words, they both understood, were not always the truest form of communication. She would write quietly in her notebook. He would sort through old volumes, never far from her side. The silence between them grew thick with meaning, as though it held echoes from other lives they had yet to recall. Occasionally, their hands would brush. Each time, it felt like an entire story exchanged in a second. One day, she brought him a pressed violet between two slips of paper. "I found this on the path where the rain meets the sun," she whispered. He took it without question and placed it inside the hollow of a forgotten dictionary. Later, he found himself opening that book again and again, as though the flower were a compass pointing to something he couldn't name. That evening, he dreamed of a tower on the edge of the sea, wind howling through its arches, and Myrano, Alina standing at its top, waiting with a candle in her hand. When he told her the next day, she smiled faintly. "I've dreamed of that place too," she said, "but you never arrived." He wanted to say, "I'm here now," but the words stayed behind his lips. Some truths didn't need to be spoken. As the days passed, the city seemed to shift around them. The rhythm of rain changed. Shadows moved differently. They began to walk home together after closing the shop, their footsteps echoing along cobbled streets. Still, their conversations were sparse, yet full. "This street reminds me of somewhere else," she'd murmur. "Yes," he'd reply, "but I don't know where." These fragments, shared in passing, wove a tapestry between them made of suggestion and silence. Orion began writing letters he never sent. In them, he described the way she tucked her hair behind her ear when she was focused, the way she tilted her head when she was listening to the rain. He hid the letters in old books, as if planting seeds for someone else to find in another lifetime. Perhaps one day, Mira or another version of her would open a forgotten page and discover what he could never say aloud. Mira, too, began painting again images she couldn't explain. A ship beneath two moons, a staircase disappearing into clouds, a pair of hands holding a flame. She painted without thought, as if remembering instead of imagining. When she showed them to Orion, he simply nodded. "I've seen these before," he said, though he had not. At least, not in this life. One night, as thunder rolled softly in the distance, they stood on the rooftop above the shop, watching the city shimmer beneath the rain. "Do you believe in past lives?" she asked. He was quiet for a long time. "I believe in patterns," he said. "And you feel like a pattern that's been repeating for a very long time." She didn't answer. She stepped closer and rested her head on his shoulder. Neither of them moved. The following morning, he found a note slipped into a book she had borrowed. It read, "I think we've done this before. I think we will again." That single sentence filled him with a warmth so deep, it silenced every voice of doubt he had ever known. He placed the note beside the violet, and for the first time in years, he sang softly to himself as he worked. There was no dramatic moment, no sudden confession, no thunderous declaration. Their love, if it could be called that, unfolded the way paper flowers open in warm water, gently, quietly, inevitably. It was not a story of passion, but of recognition. Not of beginnings, but of remembering. And that remembering gave them peace. And so, in that stone city under the endless rain, two souls met again, just as they always had. No fanfare, no prophecy. Just a quiet shop, a shared silence, and the soft rhythm of feet on wet cobblestone. A love old enough to feel new. A story without an ending. A thread picked up again, midweave. In another life, their world was made of sand and color. The sun painted the earth in gold, and the skies stretched wide above them like vast murals brushed by unseen hands. In this life, they were wanderers artists of the road, carrying with them only what they could bear, and a longing they did not yet understand. She was called Lyra, a dancer whose movements stirred dust and dreams. He was Solon, a painter who captured stories in vibrant hues that seemed to pulse on cloth and canvas. Their lives crossed in a marketplace at the edge of the desert, where spices hung in the air and the voices of merchants blended like waves of song. Lyra danced in the square, her veil catching wind like wings. The people clapped, some tossed coins, others simply stopped to breathe her in. But Solon, seated beneath the awning of a tea vendor's stall, did not move. He watched her with the stillness of recognition, not of body or name, but of essence. Something ancient stirred in him, like dust rising from forgotten stone. He knew nothing of her, yet he knew her. As she spun, her eyes brushed over him just once, and the smallest shift of expression passed across her face. Not surprise, not curiosity, something deeper, like someone returning to the doorstep of a home they had dreamed of, but never seen. That night, the desert winds blew soft and warm, and Solon set up his easel beneath the open sky. He did not sleep. He painted the movement of her hands, the curve of her silhouette, against the backdrop of sun and shadow. He had no model, no reference, only memory, or perhaps memory disguised as imagination. The colors came easily: saffron, indigo, sand. When dawn arrived, the canvas held a portrait that pulsed with life. It was her, though he had not truly seen her. It was always her. Lyra passed the same spot early that morning, barefoot, her hair still scented with night air. She saw the painting, and she stopped. He stood nearby, silent, brush still in hand. "I've danced in many places," she said softly, "but I've never felt watched like that before." Solon looked at her not with explanation, but with stillness. "It wasn't the first time," he whispered. She didn't ask what he meant. She only nodded, the way one might nod when hearing a truth they've long suspected. They spent the next days in slow circles around each other. The city's edges blurred into desert paths, and they wandered together, never straying too far from the market, yet never bound to it. She showed him how to walk by starlight. He taught her to blend pigments from dust and dried flower petals. Their conversations were unhurried, often unfolding between silences filled with shared breath and sky. The world around them remained in motion, but for them, time moved like honey. One afternoon, while resting beneath a fig tree, she told him of a dream. In it, they were children, playing beneath a fountain of silver water, laughing as though the world were made only of joy. "When I woke, I felt the echo of your hand in mine," she said. Solon reached out, not to take her hand, but to trace the air where she had described it. "I think I remember the fountain," he said. "I think we returned there often." In this life, their connection was more tactile, more rooted in the body. Lyra would rest her head against his shoulder as they watched the fire, and Solon would place his hand over her heartbeat, not to feel it, but to remember it. Their closeness didn't demand words. It asked only presence. In their embraces, there was no need for reassurance. There was only recognition, the kind that lives in the skin. The desert had a way of revealing things slowly. Beneath its vast sky, there was room to listen, not just to each other, but to the echoes between lifetimes. They began to notice signs again. A song hummed by a stranger that they both knew. A coin etched with a symbol that appeared in Solon's oldest sketches. The cry of an animal that made them pause at the same instant. These moments were quiet, but they vibrated with significance. They didn't chase meaning. They allowed it to arrive. They built a shelter near the edge of the cliffs, just a canvas and wooden frame, enough to keep out the wind. It became their home, though it wasn't made to last. Each evening, they returned with offerings: herbs, stones, pieces of fabric dyed in the market's colors. Lyra would hang them from the beams, and Solon would paint them with symbols. "Every life should have its shrine," she said, "even the ones we only stay in briefly." Sometimes they would lie on the sand and speak aloud what they remembered from lives they couldn't place: a city of ice, a ship with crimson sails, a snowfall that tasted of roses. These fragments didn't frighten them. They welcomed them like travelers arriving late to a feast. With each story, their bond deepened not because they learned something new, but because they confirmed what already lived inside them. One night, under the fullness of a heavy moon, Lyra danced not for a crowd, but for him. Her movements were slow, deliberate, like an invocation. Solon watched with reverence, as though witnessing something sacred. When she finished, she placed both hands on his chest and whispered, "I will always find you, even if I have to be born again in every corner of this world." He did not reply. He kissed her palms, and the wind carried their breath into the night. They marked the entrance to their tent with a spiral drawn in ochre, a symbol they both remembered from dreams. "It means return," Solon said. "Or maybe beginning," Lyra replied. "Or both." They agreed never to define it too closely. Some meanings, they knew, were meant to stay fluid, like wind, like time, like love that never ends. One morning, they awoke to find their tent covered in red petals. No tree nearby had shed them. No storm had brought them. They took it as a sign, not of an ending, but of transition. They knew it was time to move again, though they didn't yet know where. They packed only what they could carry, leaving the shrine intact. "So that we can return," Lyra said. "So that someone else might remember." They walked away without looking back. The desert stretched endlessly before them, golden and warm. Their shadows moved in sync, like dancers in a slow duet. They didn't speak much, but every now and then, Solon would hum a tune he didn't recognize, and Lyra would harmonize, as though she had known it all her life. Their song, like their love, did not belong to a single place or time. It had always existed, waiting to be found again. And somewhere, beneath that painted sky, a story was once again unfolding, not new, not old, but eternal. A love reborn not with fire, but with quiet breath. A promise carried across lifetimes. A vow wrapped in sand and starlight. The beginning of a chapter they had written before, now being whispered into being once more. In a world where green grew untamed and vines curled around everything in sight, they lived again, this time as caretakers of a hidden garden, tucked deep within an ancient forest. The air was damp with life, heavy with the scent of moss and wild blossoms. Here, names held little importance, and time was measured by the blooming of flowers and the migration of birds. They were known simply as the keepers. Their work was quiet, their lives even quieter. And yet, without knowing how or why, they arrived with a familiarity already nestled between them. The garden had existed long before them, though no map recorded its location. It appeared only to those who needed it, who were ready to remember something they had long forgotten. The gate, woven of roots and rusted iron, creaked open as if sighing a welcome. She stepped through first, brushing her hand along the ivy-covered arch. He followed, pausing only once to take in the scent of the air, as if inhaling memory itself. The moment they crossed the threshold, they felt it not recognition of the place, but of each other. They did not question their arrival. Questions belonged to other lives. Here, in this sacred leafy world, they worked together without explanation. She gathered herbs with hands that seemed to know exactly where to look. He tended the trees, whispering to them in a tongue he could not name. Their movements were synchronized, not practiced, but remembered. In silence, they passed tools and shared bowls of water, their fingertips grazing like the flutter of wings. Around them, the garden pulsed with stories. Each plant carried a memory, each stone a secret. Some days, they would sit for hours beneath the ancient fig tree, listening to the wind move through the branches as though it were speaking. At first, they didn't understand the language, but slowly, gently, its meaning emerged, not in words, but in feelings. Peace, continuity, love that had no edge and no beginning. The garden had no mirrors. Instead, they saw themselves in each other, in the way their eyes softened during twilight, in the stillness that settled between shared tasks. One evening, she found an old wooden bench overgrown with moss. Brushing it clean, she uncovered a single word carved into its surface. Again, they sat there often after that, not speaking, not needing to. There was a small stone fountain at the center of the garden. Its water never stopped, even in the coldest weeks. She began to dream of it at night, seeing reflections in its surface that didn't match the present. In one, she wore a crown of silver leaves. In another, he held a feathered staff. Sometimes they were children chasing one another through tall grass. She would wake with tears on her cheeks, not from sadness, but from a feeling too vast to contain. He, too, began to remember. While pruning the trees, he would hum melodies he did not know. When he touched the bark, images filled his mind temples, mountains, a firelit room where she danced in silence. Each vision was fleeting, like catching sight of a figure just beyond the fog. But with each memory, his heart grew steadier, as though remembering was the very act of becoming whole again. One morning, they discovered a hidden path behind a wall of jasmine. It led to a circular grove filled with white stones, each marked with a symbol. She bent to examine one, running her fingers along the carved lines. "These aren't graves," she said softly. "They're memories." He nodded. "Names we've worn," he whispered, and laid to rest. They sat among the stones until night fell, their bodies still, their souls listening. In this life, they rarely touched, but the space between them vibrated with knowing. A glance from across the garden. A hand paused on a tree trunk at the same moment. They began leaving small tokens for each other, a smooth pebble on a windowsill, a sprig of mint beside a cup, a folded scrap of cloth with a feather tucked inside. No explanations, just offerings from one soul to another. They began writing again, not in journals, but on pieces of bark, on petals, in the dirt. Phrases would come to them in the quiet. "I have loved you in silence. We met in the wind. Every leaf remembers you." These phrases weren't signed, but they always knew who had written them. They became part of the garden itself, living poems scattered among roots and rocks. One evening, as golden light filtered through the canopy, they stood together at the edge of the pond. He took her hand, not in desperation or need, but in reverence. "What are we?" he asked. She looked toward the water, watching the ripples move outward. "We are the echo of a promise kept," she said. Her voice was steady, soft, the quiet return of love that never left. After that, the garden seemed to glow more brightly. Flowers bloomed more easily. The animals that lived at its edges came closer, no longer wary. A fox began sleeping near their door. Birds nested in the windowsill. The whole world seemed to breathe with them, as if recognizing that a union had been remembered, not created, but recalled. One night, they dreamt together. In the dream, they were trees rooted side by side, their branches touching, their roots intertwined. They could feel the soil around them, the seasons passing through their bark. They did not speak, but they felt everything. When they woke, their hands were entwined beneath the blankets. They smiled, but said nothing. No words were needed. They knew their time in the garden would not be forever. Some places are meant only for remembering, not for remaining. But neither feared the parting. "We'll leave with full hearts," she said one morning, as dew clung to the petals around them. "And we'll find each other in the next blooming," he replied. Their pact was not bound by time, only by truth. And so, In a garden where names no longer mattered, they lived and loved once more, not loudly, not publicly, but deeply. Each leaf, each flower, bore silent witness to their reunion. And when they were gone, the wind carried whispers through the branches, soft as breath. Whispers that said, "They have returned." Whispers that said, "They will return again." In this life, they found each other among books and candlelight, in a city built on memory and ash. The buildings were old, their stones worn smooth by centuries of footsteps. Smoke curled from chimneys in every direction, rising into skies tinted by dusk and quiet snow. She was a librarian, a guardian of forgotten stories. He was a scribe, one of the last who still wrote by hand. They worked in silence, surrounded by parchment, ink, and the scent of cedar and winter. Their days unfolded in whispers and rustling pages, a rhythm too gentle to disturb. Her name in this life was Ellen. She spoke little, preferring to listen to the breath of old books, the scratch of pens, the occasional shifting of wooden chairs. She moved like a shadow, graceful, silent, reverent. The library felt like a cathedral of quiet, and she treated it as such. Every time she walked through its halls, she felt something in her chest stir, longing she couldn't name, as if someone had called her name long ago, and she was still trying to answer. He was called Tom. His fingers were stained with ink, his wrists often sore from the weight of words. He copied texts slowly, with devotion, his handwriting delicate, ornate, full of pauses and flourishes. He did not know where the symbols came from. Some did not even belong to the languages he had learned. Yet his hand moved as if guided by memory rather than knowledge. He worked in a small study beside the library's inner courtyard, where ivy grew along the stone and a bench waited beneath a frost-dusted tree. Their first conversation was not spoken aloud. Ellen had left a note in the margin of an old ledger he was transcribing. "This passage reminds me of something I've never lived." He read it in silence, heart slowing. The next day, he left a reply on her desk. "That's how I feel when I see your name on the return slips." And so began a quiet dialogue, carried not with voices, but with ink. Notes appeared in books, tucked between pages, left beneath cups of tea. Some were short, others entire paragraphs. All of them were written as if each word had already been waiting. They did not rush to meet. Weeks passed before they spoke in person, and when they did, their voices were soft, almost hesitant, as if afraid to disturb the delicate thread already forming between them. They walked together through the library's highest halls, where dust danced in shafts of light and the ceiling echoed every footstep. She told him of a dream she'd had of a burning cathedral, and a song sung in a language that felt like home. He listened with his eyes closed, nodding slowly. "I think I've sung that song," he said. With time, they grew bolder in their silences. They sat together during lunch breaks, reading quietly or exchanging fragments of poetry. Sometimes he would draw symbols in the margins of her notebooks, spirals, feathers, keys. She began to recognize them from the texts she had shelved without ever truly reading. Their lives began to echo each other, like stanzas from the same poem written across centuries. Ellen kept a journal of phrases she heard in dreams. One night she wrote, "You once promised me a fire that would never consume." She showed it to Tom without comment. He looked at the words for a long while, then retrieved an old page he had tucked in his drawer. On it, written months before, were the words, "And you, a flame I was never afraid to touch." They stared at each other across the table, and in that silence, something deeper than speech passed between them. The seasons turned. Snow gave way to rain. Rain softened into sunlight. The ivy thickened. The air grew sweet with warmth. They began to spend evenings together, sitting by the window of her apartment, reading aloud to one another. Sometimes one would fall asleep while the other kept reading, letting the rhythm of words become lullabies. Their lives had folded into one another like pages of a book that had always meant to be bound together. One afternoon, while sorting through a box of old manuscripts, Ellen found a piece of parchment that had no record in the catalog. It was written in a looping script she did not recognize, but somehow understood. As she read it, her hands began to tremble. It was a vow one made between two souls who had promised to return to each other across every incarnation. At the bottom, a symbol, the same feather Tom had drawn so many times. She brought it to him. He didn't speak. He took her hand, kissed her palm, and pressed the page between their fingers like a prayer. That night, they lit a candle between them, watching the flame dance in silence. "I think I've loved you in languages I don't remember," she said softly. Tom smiled, but his eyes were wet. "And I've waited in places I couldn't name," he replied. They did not try to explain what they felt. Some things were meant only to be lived, not dissected. Their love had roots deeper than memory, and branches that touched stars they hadn't yet reached. They began to write a book together, not of their current lives, but of all the fragments they had begun to piece together. A life by the sea, a fire-lit ritual, a flight through storm-tossed skies. Each chapter felt like a dream remembered just in time. They wrote not to publish, not to share, but to remember, to leave behind a trail for the versions of themselves who would come after. Ellen started calling him beloved in her notes. Tom called her my once and always. These names felt truer than the ones they had been given. They wrote them in the margins of their shared manuscript, encircling them with stars and vines. The book became a living thing, breathing with every new line. A record of love's resilience. A map of memory drawn in tenderness. Sometimes, while shelving books, Ellen would stop and press her hand to the spine of a particular volume, as if hearing a heartbeat inside. Tom noticed this and began hiding little slips of poetry in those books, his verses, her dreams, their shared symbols. He knew she would find them in time. He wanted her to know that even in silence, he was still reaching. On the last page of their manuscript, they wrote together, word by word, "We were never lost, only waiting. And now we remember." Below it, they pressed their thumbprints side by side, sealing the pact not with signatures, but with touch. They wrapped the book in linen and placed it in a hidden alcove of the library behind the oldest shelf. "For when we forget again," Ellen whispered. "So we may always return," Tom replied. And in that life of ink and ash, their love once again unfolded, not urgent but enduring, like the steady glow of candlelight, like a sentence written by hand, like a memory that waits patiently until we are quiet enough to hear it. In this life, they met where the earth reached closest to the sky. A mountain village carved into stone, wrapped in mist and quiet wind, was the setting for their next reunion. The clouds moved low, like thoughts drifting just above the treetops, and silence blanketed everything in a softness that felt almost sacred. She lived in a cabin on the ridge. He came with the spring thaw, his footsteps barely marking the thawing ground. Neither knew the other's name at first, but their eyes met as if continuing a conversation paused long ago. Her name was Ilya. She lived simply, tending goats and herbs, collecting rainwater, and weaving with dyed threads that shimmered like the dawn. She rose with the light and moved slowly through her days, speaking to birds and listening to the rustling of the pines. She often stood at the edge of the cliff at twilight, hands folded, eyes watching the valley as though searching for something. She didn't know it or who until he arrived. He called himself Mark, a traveler, quiet by nature, who had wandered many roads and yet felt that this place was not chosen, but remembered. He built a fire pit outside the small house he rented, laid stones with care, and began sketching in the dirt each morning, spirals, eyes, constellations. The villagers thought him odd, but Ilya watched him from a distance with recognition, not judgment. There was something in the way he touched the earth, with reverence that stirred something ancient within her. One day they met on the path to the spring, each carrying an empty jar. They paused at the same moment, each stepping aside for the other. Then both smiled. It was not the smile of strangers. It was the smile of souls who had shared firelight, silence, and soft laughter under different stars. They walked to the spring together, speaking little, but when they did, their words curled softly in the mountain air like incense smoke. Over the weeks, they began meeting more often by the river, in the woods, near the old stone wall where wildflowers bloomed in secret. They didn't plan these meetings, and yet they always happened. Sometimes they shared tea, sometimes just a look. She would bring him bread wrapped in cloth. He would leave feathers or smooth stones on her doorstep. They didn't need reasons. Their gestures spoke of remembrance without explanation. Marek began carving a wooden flute, though he had never played before. He didn't know what guided his hands, but the instrument took shape as if it had already existed. When he played for the first time, the sound was low, warm, like wind echoing through a hollow tree. Ilya listened from her window and felt her eyes well with tears, not from sadness, but from something deeper. That sound felt like home. Ilya began having dreams of high temples, of prayers whispered into bowls of water, of Marek kneeling beside her, lighting candles without ever striking a flame. She wrote these visions in a notebook she kept under her pillow. When she read them aloud to Marek one evening, he nodded slowly. "I've had the same dreams," he said. "But in mine, you always vanish before I can ask your name." That night, they sat beneath a sky so clear the stars seemed within reach. Ilya placed her hand over Marek's and whispered, "We've never needed names." He didn't respond with words. He leaned forward, resting his forehead to hers, and for a long time neither moved. Their breath synchronized, slow and deep, like waves against the shore of memory. They began building a small shrine together near the path to the spring, not for worship, but for remembrance. It was made of stones they gathered on their walks, feathers they found, pieces of bark with symbols etched by hand. They lit candles there at dusk, not to pray, but to honor something eternal, their vow, their bond, their silent return to one another. One morning, Marek found a folded cloth beneath his door. Inside was a necklace made of woven grass, tiny seeds, and a stone shaped like a heart. No note, no explanation. But he knew it was from her. He wore it beneath his shirt, where no one could see it, but where it rested close to his chest, near the place that remembered. Their love was not spoken aloud, not declared in grand gestures. It lived in stillness, in shared sunrises, in the hush of pine needles underfoot. They spent hours walking in silence, pointing at birds or clouds, pausing to feel the breeze. Their closeness did not need sound. It grew like lichen, slow, soft, unshakable. One day, as the season turned and the air grew heavy with green, Ilya gave him a piece of parchment. On it she had written, "Even if I must forget again, I will always find you in the wind." Marek traced the words with his finger, then folded the page and placed it in his coat pocket, where it remained through every walk, every storm, every silence. They marked the equinox together by planting a circle of stones around the base of an old tree. "For what we were," she said, placing hers. "For what we are," he added. "And for what we will be." They did not need a witness. The wind, the trees, and the sky were enough. That night, a fox passed by their door and sat beneath the shrine, gazing toward the mountain's peak. They watched in silence. "Do you think it remembers?" Ilya asked. Marek placed an arm around her shoulder. "I think everything alive remembers," he said. "Even the stones, even us." And so, under the high mountain sky, they lived another chapter, quiet, tender, true. No storms disturbed them. No time separated them. Their love, like the mountain, stood firm and eternal, softened only by snow, warmed only by shared breath. And each night, as they drifted into sleep, they knew the story was not ending, only continuing gently again. In this life, they were drawn to the sea, not for its vastness or its power, but for its quiet rhythm, its endless breathing. The coastline was rugged and windswept, with cliffs that fell gently into gray-blue water. Villagers called it the place where the sea dreams, because the tides moved with a kind of drowsy grace and the mist never fully lifted. She lived in a weathered cottage near the shore. He arrived with the autumn fog, walking along the rocks with a satchel full of maps and pages worn thin by salt air. Her name was Luma. She lived alone with a black dog and a shelf full of sea glass. She painted in silence boats, waves, lighthouses, and faces she didn't recognize. Her home was filled with the scent of salt and lavender. She didn't expect visitors, yet she always kept a second mug ready, as if somewhere inside she knew someone was coming. He was called Niven, a cartographer who no longer made maps for others. He wandered the coast drawing what couldn't be charted, feelings, echoes, dreams. His maps had no compass roses, no names, only symbols, spirals, eyes, a line that curved like the edge of a wave. He slept in an old inn above the dunes, where gulls cried like forgotten memories each morning. They first crossed paths at the tide pools, both crouched over the same rock to watch the silver flicker of a fish. Their eyes met, and neither spoke for a moment. There was no urgency, no alarm, just a shared stillness, as if they had found one another not for the first time, but for the 100th. She smiled, and he nodded, and the breeze carried a silence that said more than words could. After that, they often found themselves walking the same stretch of beach, sometimes in opposite directions, sometimes side by side. They collected shells, pieces of driftwood, and quiet. Luma showed him the place where the waves always left a perfect spiral of foam. Niven shared his map journal, pointing to a symbol he couldn't explain. She touched it lightly and whispered, "It means return." They began meeting intentionally tea in the garden, long walks beneath the stars, stories shared beside a fire that crackled gently in the hearth. She told him of her dreams, of lighthouses that sang, of stars falling into the ocean, of him standing on a distant shore, always just out of reach. He listened without interruption, only nodding, eyes soft and full. Niven began drawing her into his maps, not as a figure, but as a presence. A swirl of blue ink, a wave curling toward a distant cliff, a warm shape drawn near the center of each page. He never labeled it, but he always knew what it meant. One day, he handed her a folded page with no words, just a circle drawn in gold ink. She understood instantly. "It's where we meet," she said. She began painting differently after that. Her brushstrokes became slower, more fluid. She painted the same face over and over his, but not quite. Versions of him, other lifetimes maybe. In one, he wore feathers. In another, armor. In another, only a robe and a look of ancient peace. She didn't question it. She simply painted, letting her hands remember what her mind could not. On a windless morning, they sat together on the cliffs, the sea below so still it reflected the sky perfectly. "Do you think we choose each other?" she asked. "Or are we chosen?" Niven considered this for a long moment. "I think it's both," he said. "A promise we made before time remembered how to count." She closed her eyes and let the wind touch her cheeks like a memory. They built a small altar from driftwood and stones at the edge of the cliff. Nothing grand, just a quiet place where they could leave offerings, a feather, a note, a candle in a jar. They never spoke of it, but they each visited it alone from time to time. It became a kind of compass for the soul, a place where silence felt holy. On evenings when the mist rolled in thick and silver, they sat near the fireplace, reading to each other from books they found in the village library. Old myths, sea legends, letters written between lovers who never met again. They paused often, letting the words echo through the room, letting the fire hold their memories. One night, as rain tapped softly on the roof, Niven traced a spiral on Luma's wrist with his finger. "We've done this before," he murmured. "We always come back." She didn't reply. She leaned her head against his chest and listened to the rhythm of his breath, the familiar drum of a heart she had loved in more languages than she could count. As winter approached, the waves grew louder, the wind more insistent. Yet they remained steady, like the stones beneath their feet. They spoke of nothing lasting forever, yet never feared what might end. "What matters," she said once, "is that we remembered this time?" Niven smiled. "And that we left the door open for next time." They began writing messages in bottles, short notes, poems, memories, not to send away, but to place on the windowsill. A ritual of presence, a record of being seen. They wrote things like, "I knew you when the stars were young," or "The sea is quieter when you are near," and once, "You are always the shore I was looking for." And so, by the sea that never sleeps, their story lived again. Not as thunder or storm, but as tide and breath, as wind moving through reeds, as two souls sitting in the quiet, painting with words and remembering how to return to one another again and again. In this life, they lived in a city that never truly slept, yet always held quiet corners. A place where neon reflections rippled in rain-soaked pavement, where jazz spilled from open windows, and lives brushed against each other in subways and cafes. Among the bustle and brightness, there existed pockets of stillness bookstores at midnight, rooftop gardens lit by fairy lights, alleys lined with climbing ivy. It was in one of these quiet places that they met again, without knowing what they were finding. Her name was Mira. She worked in a record shop that only played vinyl, where the walls smelled of old paper sleeves and patchouli. She liked the way music could slow time. She often lost herself in the sounds of voices recorded decades ago, voices filled with longing and laughter. Her life was solitary but content. Yet, every time she closed up the shop at night, she looked out at the street with a strange ache in her chest, as if someone was just about to arrive. He was known as Leo, a photographer of forgotten corners. He wandered the city with a small, old film camera, capturing things others missed: shadows on walls, shoes left behind on doorsteps, the way morning light hit broken windows. He often passed Myra's shop without entering, drawn by the sound that spilled into the street. One night, he paused just long enough to look through the glass. She looked up from behind the counter. Their eyes met, and everything slowed. He returned the next day, and the next. Not always buying, not always speaking. Sometimes they just shared the same space, the same music, the same silence. Myra began leaving records she thought he'd like on the counter. Leo began bringing photos, placing them on the shelves without a word. It became a language between them, one built on gesture, intuition, and quiet recognition. They didn't speak about fate or soulmates or memories. But sometimes Myra would say, "This feels like déjà vu, but warmer." And Leo would nod slowly, answering, "Like I've heard your voice in a dream I forgot to remember." It wasn't poetry. It was truth spoken softly, shaped by something older than words. They began walking the city together, often in the early morning or late at night when the streets were nearly empty. They found joy in little rituals, sharing coffee from street vendors, pointing out windows lit with amber light, watching their reflections pass through puddles like ghosts revisiting their own footsteps. Nothing about them was grand, but everything felt meaningful. One evening, Myra took Leo to her rooftop. She had strung lights between chimneys and planted herbs in shipped mugs. They lay back on a blanket and stared at the sky, where only the brightest stars survived the city's glow. I think we've met under so many skies, she said. Leo reached for her hand and replied, and found each other in every one. Mira began keeping a journal, not of what happened, but of what she felt when she was with him. Like the city finally makes sense, she wrote. Like I'm not just passing through this life. She left it open once, and Leo read it while she slept. He didn't write anything in return, but he placed a Polaroid between its pages of her laughing under lamplight, blurred slightly like memory. On the corner of their street stood a mural they both loved, a painted pair of wings, faded and weathered, barely visible now. They began leaving little offerings there. Wildflowers, old ticket stubs, scribbled lines of poetry. It's our altar, Myra whispered. Even if no one else sees it, Leo nodded. Especially because no one else sees it. As seasons changed, so did their rhythm. They spent Sundays in silence, cooking together. She made soup, he made tea. They didn't need conversation. They moved around each other like dancers, knowing where to step, when to pause. Sometimes Leo would hum a melody he didn't know, and Mira would recognize it from a dream she couldn't place. On a rainy evening, they sat by the window and watched the streetlights ripple through wet glass. Do you ever feel like you're waiting for something to end? She asked. Leo thought for a long moment before answering. Only when I forget that we always begin again. She leaned into his shoulder, and together they watched the rain fall without rushing. Mira began painting again abstract shapes, mostly in gold and navy. She didn't know what they were at first, but then she recognized them in Leo's photographs. The same curve of a railing, the same shadow between two buildings. It was as if their memories were leaving breadcrumbs through their art, leading them back to places they didn't know they were from. They spoke once of dreams. Mira said she often dreamed of being underwater, but always safe, wrapped in arms, in light. Leo said he had one dream over and over, a staircase made of glass, a hand reaching down, pulling him upward. It's always your hand, he said, even before I met you. Mira smiled. I think I've been catching you for lifetimes. In a small wooden box, they began collecting things, pressed leaves, pieces of ribbon, buttons, coins. Useless objects, unless viewed as memories. They called it the proof, not for others, but for themselves, that they had loved, that they had found each other, that even in a world full of noise, something quiet and eternal still held. And so, in the city of light and silence, their story unfolded once more, not with grand declarations or sweeping gestures, but with gentle recognition, in the flicker of candlelight, in the hum of a favorite song, in the soft certainty that some loves are not found, they are remembered. In this life, they lived within walls built not to keep the world out, but to let silence in. A monastery nestled deep in a valley, surrounded by soft hills and slow rivers, became the setting of their next meeting. The stone buildings breathed with age, their walls covered in moss and prayer. Bells rang not to mark time, but to invite presence. Each day moved like wind across still water, gentle, measured, sacred. She was known as Sira, a monk who had taken vows of quietude and care. She tended the gardens and swept the stone paths. Her days began before the sun rose, when the earth was still holding its breath. She walked barefoot across the damp grass, hands clasped behind her back, head bowed not in shame, but in reverence. She rarely spoke, yet her silence was full. He arrived one spring afternoon, wearing simple robes and carrying no name. The other monks called him Ansel, though he never confirmed or denied it. His eyes were soft, his movements deliberate. He did not ask for shelter, but helped build it. He offered no wisdom, but listened deeply. The elders accepted him as if they had been waiting for him, though none could say why. Sira noticed him first, by the way he moved through space, not hurried, not hesitant, but with a rhythm that echoed her own. When he passed her on the stone walk, Their eyes met briefly, and something within her stirred. Not a memory, but a warmth, a pull, as if her soul tilted slightly, remembering a direction it had long forgotten. They did not speak, not for many weeks. Their communion began in ritual kneeling side by side in meditation, bowing together before meals, passing water bowls with steady hands. In these gestures, something old awakened. They became attuned to each other's breath, posture, presence. It was not affection as the world knows it. It was something quieter, deeper. Recognition without words. In the afternoons, Sierra would rake the garden in long, meditative lines. One day, she looked up to find Ansel watching from beneath the ginkgo tree. He didn't speak. He simply knelt beside her and began raking too, mirroring her pace. From that day forward, they tended the gravel garden together, their movements forming patterns visible only from above spirals, waves, circles that never closed. They began leaving offerings for one another in subtle ways. A folded paper crane beneath a teacup, a sprig of rosemary beside the prayer cushions, a line of verse written in the margin of an old sutra. They never signed their gifts, but always knew who had left them. Each offering was an echo, a soft reminder that love did not need voice to exist. One evening, Sierra found a bowl of water placed outside her cell. Floating in it was a small white flower, delicate and fragrant. Beside it, a note written in brushstroke, "Even in stillness, we meet." She carried the bowl inside and placed it by her window, where it caught the morning light and shimmered like memory. Ansel often sat in the old meditation hall, long after others had left, facing the eastern wall where a faded mural depicted two cranes in flight. Sierra began joining him there, without agreement or plan. They sat in silence, backs straight, eyes half closed. The air between them was charged not with longing, but with knowing. It was enough. The seasons turned gently. Leaves fell like quiet blessings. Snow blanketed the courtyard with a hush that deepened the silence. They began walking together after evening prayer, never speaking, only listening to the crunch of gravel, the wind through the bamboo, the distant hoot of owls. Their footsteps fell in sync, like verses of a sacred poem. One night, during a full moon, they lit incense in the temple and sat facing one another. No words passed between them, only breath. Sierra reached forward and touched the center of Ansel's chest, just above his heart. He placed his palm over hers. They stayed like that for a long time, as the incense curled upward and the moonlight washed the floor in silver. They spoke for the first time the day before Ansel was to leave. The monastery had taught him what he needed, and his path led elsewhere. "Have we done this before?" he asked. Sarah smiled softly. "In every silence we've shared." He bowed low before her. She returned the bow. No tears were shed. Their farewell was not an ending, only a continuation. After he was gone, Sierra tended the garden alone again. But she no longer felt alone. The rake still moved in patterns they had created together. The wind still carried his breath. The prayer cushions held the warmth of his stillness. She began writing short verses, not to keep, but to release. She placed them under stones, tucked them into trees, offered them to the air. Years passed. Others came and went. Sierra remained, her hair silvering, her steps slower but steady. She became a quiet guide, offering wisdom not through teaching, but through example. When asked about love, she would say only, "Sometimes it speaks, and sometimes it simply breathes beside you." No one understood fully, but everyone felt the peace in her words. And so, beneath the quiet temple roof, their love lived again, not loud, not visible, but eternal. A thread woven through silence, a promise kept in stillness, a bond stronger than language, softer than breath. And though they parted in body, their souls continued to sit side by side, in every moment of quiet, in every unspoken prayer. In this life, They met when the world still felt large and unformed. They were children, living in neighboring houses, separated only by a garden fence draped with wisteria. Summers smelled of sun-warmed earth and apricots, and afternoons stretched like golden thread. They did not yet have names for longing or fate, but something in them knew how to find each other, again and again, beneath the soft hush of childhood light. Her name was Ada. She had hair like honey and a quiet way of watching the world, as though it spoke to her in whispers. She often sat beneath the magnolia tree, drawing in the dirt with a stick, tracing spirals and stars and shapes that felt familiar but unexplainable. She sang to herself sometimes, little lullabies that her parents said they had never taught her. She didn't mind. The songs came from somewhere inside. He was called Eli, a boy who loved shadows and stories, who spent hours making small paper boats and floating them down the shallow stream behind the garden. He had a notebook full of sketches, faces he didn't know, places he couldn't name. When he first saw Ada, he didn't feel surprised. He only blinked, as if waking up to something he'd always known was true. They began talking through the fence, slipping notes through the vines, playing games that didn't need rules. There was no need to ask where the other had come from or what they believed in. Their friendship was like water fluid, clear, and without explanation. They built forts out of blankets, made wishes on dandelions, and shared secrets under the soft hum of dragonflies. Sometimes they would sit together for hours without speaking, watching the wind move through the trees. Eli once said, "I think I know you from before I knew anyone." Ada had smiled, eyes wide, and whispered, "I think you're the reason I never felt alone." They buried a time capsule beneath the magnolia tree. Inside it, a piece of blue ribbon, a poem Eli had written without understanding why, and a rock Ada had found that looked exactly like a heart. They promised to dig it up together when they were old enough to remember everything. As they grew, life pulled them in different directions. Eli's family moved away one spring morning, just as the petals were falling from the magnolia. Ada stood at the gate, holding the blue ribbon in her hand, and whispered goodbye like a prayer. He waved from the window, pressing his palm to the glass as the car rolled down the hill. Years passed. They forgot names, but not the feeling. In dreams, they would meet again, on swings that flew too high, in gardens lit by stars, in libraries that never closed. Their bodies changed, but the memory of each other remained like a soft humming under their skin. In her teenage years, Ada began writing story-short tales of love found and lost, always with the same recurring figure, a boy with quiet eyes and a notebook full of drawings. She didn't remember Eli's name, but her heart did. Each story was a key, each page a door. Eli took up music. He played the cello, his fingers moving with a kind of remembering that his teachers could not explain. His melodies often began as lullabies, evolving into rich, sorrowful pieces that made people cry without knowing why. He kept a photograph of a magnolia tree on his bedroom wall, though he couldn't remember where it had been taken. One autumn, by coincidence or design, they found themselves again in the same city. It was a chance encounter, a bookstore, a corner table, a dropped notebook. She picked it up, handed it to him, and their eyes met like magnets realigning. Neither spoke right away. There was no need. The silence said everything. They began meeting for coffee, then walks, then long hours sitting by the river, speaking of dreams that felt like echoes. Ada showed him her stories. Eli played her his music. Together, they remembered what their minds had forgotten. "You're the boy from my garden," she whispered. "You're the girl who drew stars," he replied. They visited their childhood neighborhood together. The houses had changed, the fence had been replaced, but the magnolia still stood, tall, silent, in bloom. They dug carefully beneath it and found the time capsule still waiting. The ribbon, the poem, the stone, all as they had left it. Ada began to cry. Eli held her hand. "We didn't forget," she said. "Not really," he answered. From that day on, they didn't speak of destiny. They didn't need to. Their lives unfolded naturally, gently, as if guided by a song only they could hear. They didn't rush to define anything. They simply stayed close, walking beside one another through every season that followed. And so, in the garden of small beginnings, their love took root once more, not with passion or thunder, but with tenderness and trust, in the hush between sentences, in the smile that comes from knowing, in the story that had always been waiting to be retold, not with fanfare, but with quiet joy, like two souls who had finally come home.